We also found a small cross made of sticks jammed into the earth beside a torn root. War is full of tiny altars no one ever visits. My name is Corporal Elijah Brooks, 19 years old when I shipped out from Georgia in 1944. A black kid in an all-white company except for two others like me. By the winter push in the Italian hills, I had already learned two things. The enemy in front of you wants you gone, but sometimes the ones behind you think you are disposable. That winter was when I found out what impossible orders look like written in real men's blood. We were dug into the edge of a rocky vineyard that had been a farm once. Frost on the vines, stone walls half crumbled from weeks of shelling. Our company had lost a third of its strength holding a ridge the maps called Hill 302. The brass believed the ridge overlooked a supply road the Germans needed, so we had to hold it even if it meant no one walked off alive. Our platoon leader was Lieutenant Harris, young, eager to impress the colonel. He looked at maps more than at us. The man we trusted was Sergeant Thomas Malloy, 28, hard jaw, Irish Boston accent, and a way of talking to you that made you think he saw straight through your excuses. Malloy never smiled, but he kept us alive longer than we deserved. I'd been raised to work twice as hard to get half the credit, and the Army wasn't much different. Some men never said a word about my skin. Some never had to. You could see it in the way they waited for me to slip up, as if one mistake could prove every ugly thing they'd been taught. Malloy wasn't soft, but he judged you by whether you carried your weight. And that was enough for me. The night the order came down, the valley was choked with fog so thick it felt alive. The radio sputtered in our dugout. Then the words came clear. Advance 100 meters past the stone wall at 0400. Take and hold the forward rise. Reinforcements by daylight. Everyone stared at Harris. Even he knew it was suicide. The forward rise was open ground, chewed up by artillery, overlooked by two German machine gun nests. You couldn't cross that stretch in daylight, let alone in pre-dawn fog without armor or mortars. Harris read the order twice, like the words might change. Malloy just rubbed his face with both hands and said nothing for a long while. Finally he said, "We'll go, but we go smart, quiet, pairs, no heroics." That was Malloy. Never disobeyed an order out loud, but always tried to twist it just enough to save some of us. That night I lay in the frost-stiff dirt listening to the breathing of the man next to me, Rodriguez from Texas, while shells cracked somewhere down the valley. I remember thinking the fog smelled like wet ashes and copper, like the earth already knew it was about to drink more blood. I also remember thinking about home, my mother's hands scrubbing laundry, my father's silence at the dinner table, how proud they were that their boy was serving, how I hadn't told them what it felt like to march beside men who never looked me in the eye unless they were in trouble. At 0330, Malloy tapped my shoulder. "Brooks, you're with me on the left pair. Stay low, follow my step." We moved before dawn's first hint of gray. 4 pairs in staggered line, rifles hugged close, bayonets fixed but praying not to use them. The frost crunched under our boots even when we tried to glide. Halfway across the first stretch, we heard the metallic rattle of a German gun being adjusted. We froze like deer, faces down in the cold mud. No shot came. Maybe they couldn't see through the fog either. We slid forward again, inches at a time, breath fogging the air right in front of our noses. We made the stone wall just as a flare hissed up from the German side, burning white through the fog. Everyone dove to the wall's lee side, hearts hammering. Shadows danced huge and distorted across the mist, but no bullets followed. For a heartbeat, I believed maybe, just maybe, we'd surprise them. Then the flare burned out, and we heard the cough of a machine gun bolt being yanked back. Malloy's whisper was steady even then. "We hold here till I say move." In that moment, I knew 2 things for certain. The man was afraid just like the rest of us, and he wasn't going to let that fear show. That was the first night I began to understand what kind of man Sergeant Malloy really was. The kind who would carry an order on his shoulders so the rest of us wouldn't crumble under it. And that was only the beginning of the orders that would cost us more than we could pay. Dawn didn't break so much as creep, a thin gray turning the fog into dirty wool. We were still belly down behind that stone wall while the machine gun on the ridge coughed short bursts to remind us who owned the daylight. The ground smelled like wet iron. My cheekbone throbbed from pressing it into the rock. Lieutenant Harris slid along the wall until he reached Malloy. "Order says take the forward rise by 06. He said it like reading a grocery list. "Reinforcements behind us by 7. Malloy didn't blink. "Sir, the rise is covered by enfilade from the orchard. We move now. We lose half in the first 50 yards. Recommend smoke, then bound by 2s. Harris hesitated, jaw tight. "Do it." Malloy looked at me. "Brooks on smoke. Rodriguez, you're his shadow. We go on my count." I popped 2 smoke grenades and rolled them ahead, white billows boiling low and thick. The fog ate the smoke, stretched it, smeared it into something like mercy. We went over the wall in pairs, boots slipping on frost-slick stone, breath punching out of us in quick bursts. The first pair cleared 20 yards. The second pair stalled when the right side gun woke up and stitched a line through the mist. We dropped flat, mud seeping through our jackets, the smell of cordite and churned earth closing over us like a lid. A cry cut through the clatter. "Medic!" A private on our right kicked, then went limp, blood soaking into the gray. I crawled to him while the gun chattered again, bullets lashing low. He was white, freckles slick with sweat, eyes glassy. I hooked my hands under his collar and dragged him back one body length at a time, my knees finding every sharp stone the vineyard could hide. "Hold still," I told him. Even though he wasn't going anywhere, he tried to say thanks without looking at me. People think you don't notice that part when the world is on fire. You do. You always do. Malloy slid in beside us and shoved a bandage into my palm. "Good pull, Brooks. Back in the line." We crawled forward again, trading inches for minutes. The smoke thinned. The guns got bolder. Malloy kept us moving, short rushes, never more than 2 at a time. Harris stayed behind the wall with the radio, whispering into the handset like he could persuade the universe. When the handset spat back nonsense and static, he thumped it with his fist. We reached a shallow fold of ground just shy of the rise. You could see the orchard now, trees stripped and black, bark torn by shrapnel. Somewhere behind that orchard were 2 MGs with a rhythm like bad music. Malloy nodded to me and Rodriguez. "Flank left. Get eyes on those pits. Don't shoot unless they see you." His voice was even. Mine wasn't. We crawled sideways through brittle grass, elbows and forearms taking turns as plows. The world narrowed to dirt under my nose and the rattle of links when someone fed the gun another belt. I found a low notch in the ground and eased my head up just enough to see. The first pit was sandbagged tight, muzzle black and hungry. The second was further back, swept to cover the first. Classic crossfire. They'd been zeroing this field for days. Rodriguez breathed. "We need mortars." "We don't have mortars," I said. We crawled back. A shell dropped short and threw wet soil over us in a sour wave. Harris met us halfway, his face pale under the grime. "What did you see?" "Crossing fires," I said. "If we charge, they feed us to the dirt." Malloy rubbed his jaw. "Then we don't charge. We pull to the fold, dig, and make them spend ammunition." He looked at Harris. "Sir," Harris swallowed. "Orders are to take the rise." Malloy held his eyes a full second. "We can take it or we can hold until smoke and guns show. You want names on a paper or men still breathing when the sun climbs?" For a heartbeat, I thought Harris would push anyway. Then something tired settled into his shoulders. "Hold and dig." We clawed at the ground with entrenching tools and fingers until our nails bled. The earth was cold and stubborn. We made shallow coffin shapes and slid into them like men trying to borrow an extra hour from time. The guns raked us whenever we lifted our heads. I learned the shape of every clod between me and the orchard. I learned the taste of fear that you swallow because if you spit it out, someone else might slip on it. By mid-morning, the radio crackled with a voice that sounded far away and important. "Hold positions. Artillery will prep the rise. Reinforcements delayed." The word delayed hung in the air like frost. Rodriguez smiled without humor. "Delayed means never until it's too late." Malloy didn't smile at all. He looked at me and said, "Keep your men alive, Brooks. That's the only order that makes sense. Some orders wear gold on their shoulders. Some orders are written in the dirt between 2 boots, passed with a look that says we either walk out together or not at all. I chose the second order. That morning it felt like choosing myself. The barrage came just before noon, slow and mean, not ours. The first shells walked toward us from the left, feeling for the wall, correcting, then falling in strings that buckled the ground. The air turned into needles. Dirt hammered my helmet. I pulled my chin into my chest and wrapped my arms over my head while the world howled. "Stay down!" Malloy shouted, voice thin under the roar. The sky answered by slamming another crated ton into the ridge behind us. Someone cried for his mother, then someone else told him he was all right, even if it wasn't true. The ground jumped and then settled a little lower, like a lung that had decided not to fill again. A shell hit near our foxhole and folded the lip of it over us. Darkness poured in like water. The weight came next, cold and immediate. Soil pressed my ribs, my hips, my face. For a second I couldn't breathe. Panic is loud in the dark. I clawed with my hands and felt nothing but packed earth. I tried to shout, but the dirt took the sound and made it smaller. A hand found my wrist. "Rodriguez." He squeezed twice. I squeezed back. We dug toward each other because the space between our fingers was the only world that mattered. Time slowed to a point. I learned what roots feel like when you tear them barehanded. I learned that clay tastes like old pennies when you grind it with your teeth. Light appeared as a thin thread. Someone outside was carving at the collapse with a shovel and a curse. The thread widened to a blade and then to a hole big enough for a face. Malloy's face. He was red with effort, eyes wild. "Breathe, Brooks," he said, as if breathing were something he could command like a fire team. He and another man hauled us by our collars out of the dirt-wet grave and shoved us into air that felt too bright. I rolled onto my back and coughed until black dots swam. My hands shook like they belonged to someone older. Rodriguez laughed a broken sound, then slapped my shoulder twice. "Still ugly," he said. It was the kindest thing he could have said. The radio lay on its side near the wall. Antenna snapped. The operator, a kid named Weller, was curled around it like he could shield it with his bones. Doc touched Weller's neck and then covered his face with a torn field dressing. No one spoke for a few breaths. Then the guns started again. We pulled what dirt we could out of the hole and set the lip higher with sandbags, like building a lid on a pot that kept trying to boil over. The orchard guns shifted to rake, our line from a new angle. Malloy crawled spot to spot, putting hands on shoulders, moving men by inches, making a pattern out of chaos. He had a map in his head and we were the pins. Harris showed up with a spare radio and a voice that shook. "Command says reinforce left and prepare to push when our guns finish." "Our guns aren't talking," Malloy said. "Theirs are." "Message repeats every 10 minutes, Harris said. "We push." Malloy's eyes flicked to me and back. "We prepare." He didn't change tone. He didn't change posture. He just didn't move the line into the teeth of those pits. Harris stared at him like a man looking at a cliff he'd been told to jump from. Another shell hit the vineyard wall and turned 3 stones into shrapnel. One piece nicked my ear and left a warm line that felt like a lie. More heat than pain. I pressed a sleeve to it and kept scanning. The ground teaches you to do only the one next right thing. Today that was staying flat and listening for the pause between bursts. The barrage tapered to probing shots. A fire team from the orchard edged forward to see whether we were dust or men. Malloy let them come 10 yards beyond where they should have, then gave a low, "Now." We rose as one piece of ground that had decided to be teeth, and we bit. The team folded in seconds. We dropped back before the machine guns found our heads again. Through it all, I noticed little things. How Harris's hands trembled when he put the handset down. How Malloy kept his left sleeve rolled lower because blood from a scrape on his forearm wouldn't stop. How Rodriguez kept checking if I was still there with quick glances that pretended to be something else. How a couple of men still didn't meet my eyes as they took the extra bandoliers I crawled over with. The war outside you is work. The war inside you is heavier. Both were happening at once. By late afternoon, the ridge was a chessboard we were losing slowly. Malloy looked older. Harris looked smaller. I felt both older and smaller, which is a trick the ground plays until you stand up and lie to it by moving anyway. "Night will help us," Malloy said. "If we're still here to use it." I believed him because the alternative was a hole that didn't open again. Dark came in a rush, like someone pulled a blanket over the hills. The wind turned cold and the fog returned, thicker than morning, smelling like wet wool and stone dust. We took stock by touch. Ammunition low but not gone. Bandages damp but usable. Men worn thin but still listening when Malloy spoke. Harris crouched by the spare radio and whispered with brigade. When he finished, he looked at Malloy with a face that was all bone. Orders stand. Push to the rise and hold until relieved. Relieved by what? Rodriguez muttered, not quite under his breath. Malloy kept his eyes on the dark. We'll pick at the edges, not the teeth. 2-man teams. Cut their wire, mark their pit mouths, come back breathing. We do not trade men for dirt we can't keep. Harris said, That's not the order. Malloy finally looked at him. It's the only way anyone is alive at dawn. Harris didn't agree. He also didn't stop it. Sometimes leadership is letting the man who knows take the wheel while you hold the map and pretend. I took wire cutters and black tape. Rodriguez took a coil of white cloth to knot around saplings as silent markers. We slipped into the vineyard rows, boots finding the soft parts between stones. The orchard ahead was a mass of darker dark. The guns were quiet, which meant the gunners were listening. We reached the first apron of wire and went to our knees. The stuff was twisted and mean, barbs catching sleeves and skin. I cut in slow bites while Rodriguez eased strands aside and held them with 2 fingers, his breath on my cheek warm and steady. Every snip clicked in my bones louder than any shot. We slid through and bellied down. The first pit was 10 yards beyond, sandbags stacked clean, guns sleeping on its mount with a cloth pulled over the receiver like a blanket. 2 shapes slumped beside it, helmets tipped forward. I heard one man's slow sleep breath. The other didn't breathe at all. Even in the dark, you can feel the difference. We didn't touch the gun. We didn't touch the men. We fixed a cloth marker 2 trees back and crawled away, leaving a ghost breadcrumb that would make sense to us in the dark and to no one else. On the way back, we found a spool of field phone wire and cut a section clean so no line would carry orders when the shooting started again. I put the wire in my pocket because I wanted to carry something that belonged to them. When we made the wall, Malloy was waiting with 2 more teams. We whispered what we'd seen and pressed the loop of phone wire into his palm. He squeezed it once. Good work. Again. He sent the other teams to the right and center. He kept me to the left. In the next hour, we marked 2 more pits, a mortar position framed by 3 stones and a shallow trench where a squad took turns sleeping. We also found a small cross made of sticks jammed into the earth beside a torn root. War is full of tiny altars no one ever visits twice. On our last trip back, we heard boots rushing where no boots should run. A flare went up from the orchard, turning the fog into hot milk. The gun we'd marked first tore a line through the vineyard and cut the air where our faces had been seconds before. We hugged dirt until the flare died and the afterimage burned out of our eyes. Back behind the wall, Harris hissed, "They saw you. You've given away our intent." Malloy shook his head. "They know we intend to live. That's not news." He unfolded a scrap of ration box with a rough sketch we'd made in pencil. "We don't charge a chessboard. We tip it." He pointed to the field phone line we'd cut. "At 03, we lay smoke and rake these mouths while second squad crawls to here and here. When the guns swing, we're not where they're aimed." Harris stared at him a long moment. "If this fails, it's your responsibility," Malloy said. "It's my responsibility if it works." I felt the words like a blanket thrown over all our backs. You don't realize a man is holding the roof up until the wind starts and the roof stays. That night, in the wet fog with my hands still smelling like another army's wire, I began to trust Malloy the way you trust a plank over a ravine. Not because it's strong, but because it holds and you have to cross. We settled in to wait for the hour that hurts. Men cleaned rifles by memory. Doc relabeled the last 2 morphine syrettes with tiny pencil marks so he would know where they went. I tucked my tags inside my shirt because I didn't want the metal to flash if another flare went up. Somewhere down the line, a white kid named Fuller asked me if I thought we'd see Georgia again. I told him yes, even though I hadn't been asked that in years without hearing the other thing he wasn't saying. 03 crept closer. The fog thickened, then thinned, then folded itself low like a cat on a hearth. We stacked smoke by the gap in the wall and counted down with our chests. When Malloy finally said, "Now," It felt like the ground exhaled. We popped smoke, poured it, spread it with our own bodies, until the orchard's teeth disappeared. Then the guns woke, and so did we. 03 arrived the way bad news does, quietly and right on time. The fog lay low like a sleeping animal, and our stacked smoke grenades waited by the gap in the wall. Malloy crouched with his palm flat to the boards, as if feeling the bridge between breath and motion. When he said, "Now," we pulled pins and rolled white into the orchard's mouth. The first grenades boiled a curtain knee-high, then shoulder-high. We fed the smoke with our bodies, tossing and dragging until the gun mouths disappeared. The orchard answered with a blind burst that chewed the stones where our faces had been seconds earlier. We stayed flat and listened to the rattle of links as their loaders guessed at shapes. Second squad slithered to the markers we'd tied in the dark. Rodriguez tapped my boot twice and we slid left, elbows digging furrows, rifles tight to our chests. I could taste the smoke on my tongue, chalk and old pennies. My world shrank to a triangle of ground from my sight to the next clod of dirt. We found the first pit by smell before sight, oil, canvas, breath. Through the white I saw the sandbag lip and the black hole of the receiver under its cloth. A shadow moved. The gunner tore the blanket off and reached for the grip. I rose enough to put 3 rounds where his hands were supposed to be, and he dropped backward like someone had cut a string. Rodriguez lobbed a grenade past my shoulder. It thumped into the pit and popped with a hard, hollow cough that pushed dirt into our teeth. Voices shouted 2 trees right. I pivoted low and sent short bursts through the smoke, not at men I could see, but at angles the map in my head demanded. Someone fired back. A round tore my sleeve and grazed the meat of my forearm with a hot line that lied about how bad it was. I pressed my elbow to my side and kept moving. On the center line, Fuller's silhouette appeared and vanished like a trick of lantern light. He reached the second marker, dropped to a knee, and cut the apron wire with steady hands I would not have credited him with yesterday. When the cloth marker brushed his cheek, he smiled like a boy who had found the next breadcrumb home. Then a flare hissed up from the far orchard and turned the smoke into milk. Everything froze for a heartbeat. The flare's light made us all ghosts. The second pit swung to meet the brightness like a sunflower to dawn. Before it could bite, Malloy's voice came low and sure from somewhere behind my teeth. "Left rake!" We raked, not wild, not standing. 3 rifles from the left, 1 from the center, 2 from right, all stitched where the pit's throat had to be. The gun choked. A man screamed. Another tried to drag him by the collar, and Rodriguez put a single shot into the dragger's helmet and the body folded neat. The flare burned out and the orchard sucked the light back like breath. We moved in the dark we had bought. Second squad crawled over the lip and spilled into the trench that fed the pits. Knives whispered. A shovel butt knocked someone down. I heard hard breathing and the soft syllables men make when they wish they were home. On our right, Kenny got loud too early. He tripped a stake he should have felt, and a string of tin rattles clinked like a cheap bell in a Sunday doorway. The third position woke with a panicked burst that walked the dirt where his legs had just been. He flattened and swore through his teeth. Before they could correct, Doc of all people pitched a smoke can into the trench from his belly, and the white folded over the mistake like a blanket. Malloy's hand closed around the back of Kenny's collar and dragged him 2 yards to the good. We didn't chase. We tipped the board and then we held it crooked. Malloy hissed the word back, and we peeled away in pairs, withdrawing on our bellies the same careful lines that brought us in. As we slid, I cut another loop from a fresh run of field phone wire, clean and quiet. No one would be telling the orchard what to do for a while. At the wall, we took stock by touch. 2 men bled light, slow and manageable. 1 man's breath whistled but evened when Doc pressed a pad down hard. My forearm leaked a thin line that looked dramatic and felt petty. Rodriguez's grin was white and feral in the dark. Fuller's teeth chattered, but his hands still worked the bolt like he was cranking a well. Harris arrived with the spare radio cradled like a baby and a face that had forgotten how to be young. "Report," he said. Malloy didn't waste words. "Left pit cold, center degraded, their line is blind. We hold, not push." Harris looked past him into the orchard as if he could see the map we had made of cloth and wire and blood. For once he didn't repeat the order that had been written far away. He nodded once and said, "Hold." We rebuilt the lip of our positions and fed the Browning a fresh belt. The smoke thinned to a low fog and the orchard kept its sulk. A few test rounds came through high and lazy. We stayed under them and let them pass. The moon tried to climb, but a bank of cloud shouldered it aside. Somewhere down the line, Fuller's voice came small. "Sarge, you think we did it?" Malloy's answer was simple. "We did what keeps you breathing." He moved along the wall with his palm on shoulders, one at a time. The way men say more than words can carry. When his hand reached me, it pressed twice, the same way Rodriguez had in the dirt when it all went dark. I felt steadier than I had any right to. A little before first gray, the orchard spoke again. Not guns. Boots. Quiet. Careful. They were checking their wounds, not giving us new ones. We let them. No flares rose. No medals were earned. That was fine with me. At dawn, the fog pulled back and showed what the night had bought. The forward rise no longer stared at us with two black eyes. The pits were torn mouths stuffed with canvas and dirt. The trench between them sagged like a rope that had been cut on one end. We had not taken the hill. We had not obeyed the sentence written in clean ink. We had made a place where men could live until the sun stood up. The radio coughed and a far voice said the words I had learned to hate. Reinforcements delayed. Hold positions. The delay hung on the air like breath in winter. Malloy rubbed his jaw and looked at me. "You keep your men low. You keep them fed. You keep them angry at the right things." I nodded and looked at the orchard one more time. The field looked the same as when the night began, but it wasn't. The board had been tipped. Not enough to win a war, but enough to get to sunrise with the same names you started with. That was the first time I believed we might see noon. It was also the first time I wondered what price daylight would charge. We went up that hill at dawn, not because it was smart, but because the order was stamped and signed in somebody else's ink miles behind the line. The fog clung to the ground like it was trying to hold us back. Every boot step crunched in frost that sounded too loud, like we were cracking glass underfoot. Lieutenant Harris moved like a man carrying two packs, his own gear and the weight of command. He checked every weapon as we filed past him, palm resting a second on each man's shoulder. When it was my turn, his eyes lingered. "Brooks," he said quietly, "you keep your head low and that radio dry. If they cut us off, you're the only line we got." I nodded, trying not to think about how often the enemy aimed for the guy with the antenna. Rodriguez fell in behind me, muttering under his breath in Spanish, the way he always did when he was scared but didn't want anyone to know. Up ahead, Private Hankins grumbled about the mud freezing his laces. Harris shot him a look and the complaining stopped. We made it halfway up the incline before the first crack of rifle fire snapped past us. It was close enough that I felt the air slap my ear. We dove for the frozen dirt, rifles barking back almost before we hit the ground. I crawled to a shallow depression, tried to keep the handset clear of mud, and called back to battalion for artillery support. The reply came thin and tinny. "Negative. Guns still repositioning. Hold position." We were on our own. The firefight lasted 20 minutes but felt like the whole morning. We finally pushed them off the lower slope with grenades and sheer stubbornness, but at a cost. 2 wounded. One man's leg shredded. We dragged him behind a boulder and wrapped a field dressing that went red in seconds. "Keep moving," Harris ordered, voice flat, eyes already on the next rise. You could see in the way his jaw clenched that he'd carry every casualty like another notch in his own ribs. That was his burden. Ours was to keep following. When we reached the ridgeline, the wind came howling from the east and brought with it the stench of burned timber. Enemy bunkers we'd shelled earlier. I risked a glance through the binoculars and spotted what looked like a supply truck tucked behind a ruined farmhouse. I passed the word to Harris. He squinted, nodded once, then gave the hand signal to flank. No words, just the chop of his fist through the air. We crept down the far side, hearts pounding so hard I could feel mine in my throat. No more jokes, no more muttering. Every man knew how fast a hill could turn into a grave if we slipped. When we finally took the farmhouse, it was empty. Just a burnt-out stove and a couple of shell crates. But the real discovery was worse than enemy ammo. A folded map left on the table, edges scorched, marked with neat red lines that mirrored our own approach routes. They'd known we were coming. Either they had a spotter in the valley or someone behind our lines had passed it along. Harris didn't curse, didn't even blink. He just folded the map, tucked it in his jacket, and said, "We move before dark." That was the moment I began to understand why the men followed him. Orders might come from headquarters, but out here on the hill, survival came from Harris. We dug in for the night on the backside of the ridge, using our entrenching tools to scrape at the half-frozen soil. The stars came out sharp as nails, and every breath smoked white. I could feel the tension crawling up everyone's spine, waiting for the counterattack we all knew would come. Rodriguez passed a tin of beans down the trench to me. "They knew we were coming," he said quietly. I nodded toward Harris, sitting a few yards away, hunched over the captured map, the glow of a tiny penlight on his face. "He knows it too," I said. Close to midnight, distant engines rumbled in the valley below. Enemy trucks shifting positions. Harris signaled for silence. He came over and crouched next to me. "Brooks, soon as you hear anything heavier than a truck, you call for fire on these coordinates." He tapped the map. "Don't wait for my say-so." I gave a tight nod. We both knew what he was really saying. "If I go down, you keep the line alive." An hour later, the night exploded, first with the scream of mortar rounds, then the ripping chatter of machine guns. Flares turned the ridge into daylight and shadow, blinding and dark by turns. Our rifles answered, the barrel of the Browning glowing red again before long. Through the chaos, I heard someone shouting for a medic. Hankins was hit. We hauled him back under covering fire. Harris himself dragged the kid by his web gear, never once ducking. When dawn finally clawed its way up the sky, we were still holding, but barely. We counted our ammo. Half gone. Water. Low. Men. 2 dead. 3 more wounded. While I radioed the sit-rep, Harris went to check the enemy dead. He came back with a grim set to his jaw and showed me something he'd taken off a body. Another folded message slip, with our hill's designation underlined and today's date circled. Whoever was feeding them intel hadn't just guessed. Before we could dwell on it, headquarters called through, "Hold the hill at all costs." Relief column delayed. I remember Harris staring at the handset like he could see the brass on the other end. "All costs," he muttered. Then he looked at me and said quietly, "That cost's always the men who can't afford it." I knew what he meant. Not just about casualties, but about the way people like him and like me got treated when the reports went up the chain. If something went wrong, blame rolled downhill until it landed on the ones already carrying the heaviest packs. That evening, a runner arrived with written orders. We were to push forward, again despite the casualties and the lack of supplies. The men looked at Harris, waiting for him to say it was impossible. Instead, he folded the paper, tucked it in his breast pocket, and told them to dig new fighting holes. His eyes found mine over their heads, tired, resigned, but steady. That was when I began to fear the story we'd end up telling after the war wouldn't be about the hill at all, but about how they broke a good man trying to follow bad orders. The last attack came before sunrise on the 3rd day. A ground-hugging fog crawled in from the valley, so thick I could barely see Rodriguez crouched 5 feet away. We heard them before we saw them. Boots scuffing rock, the metallic clink of bayonets bumping rifles. Harris passed word down the trench. "Hold fire until you see the whites of their eyes." Old-fashioned order, but it made sense. We were nearly out of ammo. They broke through the mist at 20 yards and all hell opened again. Muzzle flashes strobed faces into brief ghosts. The recoil bruised my shoulder raw. Rodriguez's helmet rang with a glancing round but stayed intact. He spat dirt and kept firing. Somewhere down the line, Hankins screamed but didn't stop pulling his trigger. Mid-fight, the radio went dead. Antenna hit. I scrambled to patch it while bullets stitched the sandbags inches above my head. Harris crawled over, covering me with his own body until I got a signal back. The first words I sent out were a grid for artillery danger close on our own slope. When the barrage finally landed, it rolled over us like the sky falling, shrapnel hissing past so close it singed my sleeve. The blast scattered the attackers and gave us the breath we needed, but it also cost us 2 more men who'd been outside the trench when the first shells fell. I still remember Harris's face when he realized. Grief swallowed fast by the need to keep commanding. We held the line until the firing sputtered out near noon. Silence returned, ugly and heavy. Smoke from the barrage drifted low across the churned snow and dirt. hiding the hilltop in a gray shroud. Then came the final blow, not from the enemy but from our own command. A courier arrived, mud-splattered and shaking, with a written reprimand charging Harris for unnecessary loss of men and misuse of artillery. They were pinning the friendly fire deaths on him. I felt something in my chest go cold. We all knew those shells had saved the rest of us, but the brass needed a scapegoat to cover the bad call to hold the hill with no supplies. And Harris, tough, scarred Harris, was the name they chose to stain. He didn't argue. Just signed the receipt for the papers, folded them neat, and stuffed them in his pocket. When I asked why he didn't fight it, he said, "Because if I make noise, they'll drag every one of you through it too." That's the last order he ever gave me. To keep my mouth shut. I kept it until now. We finally got relieved the next day, limping off that hill past rows of frozen shell holes that looked too much like open graves. Harris walked at the rear, steady despite the bruise blooming across his ribs from shielding me. He saluted the new CO, handed over the hill, and never said a word about the charge pinned to his name. I heard later he was reassigned to logistics far from the line. He deserved a medal. They gave him paperwork instead. I've carried that silence for decades, the weight of a good man's reputation buried under bad ink. Telling it now won't change the record books, but maybe it'll set one thing straight. That hill didn't hold because of strategy or luck. It held because a sergeant took the fall so the rest of us could walk away. If you've listened this far, share this story so men like him aren't forgotten. Hit subscribe. Leave a comment with the name of someone you served with who deserves to be remembered. Stories like this survive only if we keep speaking them aloud.